by the freed slave himself and not interpreted by missionaries or ethnographers or others who collect these kind of documents. So I think that's one thing that makes it quite different. And therefore I think it's quite useful in that some of the emphases that are typically placed on these kinds of slave narratives are not so present in this document. For example, if you look at some of these slave narratives, for example, those collected by Marcia Wright in East Africa, Central East Africa, the rites of passage, through conversion are a central part of those kinds of narratives, because this is the highlight of the mission, endeavour to convert Africans. And so these kinds of narratives that are collected by others and then have that gloss, that missionary gloss, tend to highlight certain things. Well, if you look at Arteman's narrative, his conversion gets a few lines. And far more, although he does convert, of course, and he's a staunch Catholic, he's a catechist. But other things, such as his education, loom far more centrally in the narrative. Significantly, he doesn't say a huge amount about the experience of being enslaved and the terrible journey across the Sahara Desert to Algeria. But of course, he was a 10-year-old child at that time, so that's not surprising. And so the narrative, essentially, I would say at least 3/4 of it focuses on his life and work as a doctor catechist in the Lake Tanganyika region. Okay, so let's look at his life just a little bit. But before I do that, I'll just mention the 3 themes that in this larger project I'm working on in connection with Arteman's life. The 3 major issues that I'm looking at are the process of enslavement, what happened to slaves in the Niger Bend, what were the typical experiences of slaves, how was Arteman's experience different, and obviously it was very different because he was redeemed and then trained and educated. So in that sense, of course, it's very exceptional, but it does tell us still something about the experience of in the late 19th century of young slave children. So in my analysis, which I can't go into very much today, I'm looking at the process of enslavement, the experience of the journey, the middle passage, if you like, across the Sahara, the matter of redemption, and that in itself, I think, is worth looking into. I've got a number of probably just about all of the major works written about Cardinal Lavigry, the founder of the White Fathers Mission in Africa. I've got 7 or 8 of these books, and virtually none of them deal with the question of redemption. It's just mentioned in passing. So I think in the literature that needs a little bit more attention. I mean, we've got a significant literature now on pawnship, on manumission and so on, but Marty, maybe you can correct me here, but I don't think there's a heck of a lot on redemption by missionaries.
The Tubman is working on the ransom and redemption.
Yeah, ransoming, but I think they see that as a separate process. So I will be looking at that. And then, of course, there's the question of his life in Karema on Lake Tanganyika. And the way I see that, because that's my own specialty, of course, is as an East Africanist. So my journey into the Niger Bend region and the Sahara is somewhat of a tangent for me, but it's a very exciting, very interesting experience for me to look at the history of this, some aspects of the history of a different region. On the East African side of things, what I'm doing is looking at Arteman as just one of the characters, one of the figures involved in the formation of new communities, such as the one at Karema. And these communities, not all of them were mission, many of them were trading commercial centres. But these to me represent a new kind of incipient urbanisation in East Africa, where you have new communities emerging out of slaves who are brought from all kinds of origins, traders, porters, elephant hunters, askari, and then of course missionaries and so on. So there are dozens of these new centres which emerged particularly in the middle and the late 19th century, dotted all over Central Africa, Eastern Central Africa. And many of these develop into modern towns and cities. The most important one, of course, in the interior of Tanzania, modern Tanzania, was a city called Tabora, which emerged out of these processes of commercialization. The White Fathers were there as well, not surprisingly. So you have the emergence of new towns, modern towns, but the slave experience and the freed slave experience is central to these new communities. Okay, so let me just talk for 5 minutes or so about his life. He was born in around 1866 in a place called Tundurma, or perhaps another village called Tindurma. They were very similar names. If you look at the map there, you can see Timbuktu at the top, and Gundam to the southwest. Well, it was somewhere in that region, and I've got a more detailed map here. You can see Gundam there, and you can see a village. There's Tundurma, and then there's another one called Tindurma. So I'm not exactly sure which one of those two, but you can see the region. It's in the region of the lakes on the upper Niger River, the channels. There are multiple channels of the river. I'm not quite sure exactly how many, but this is a region with a lot of waterways, and it's sort of an interface of the settled agricultural areas and the pastoral nomadic regions. And so that factors into the history of this region to a great extent. So sometime before his 10th birthday, he was enslaved by a Tuareg and taken to Timbuktu, just down the river a little, of course not quite on the river, where he was sold to an Arab. Sometime after, a few weeks later, he was taken from Timbuktu and travelled with a caravan across the Sahara to Algeria. In 1876, in Medlili, near Insala, one of the major caravan centres of the Algerian Sahara, he was redeemed along with 5 other children by White Father missionaries who took him to Algiers. And there he was placed in the White Father orphanage, and he actually met Cardinal Lavigary, the founder of the mission, who had in 1868 founded the Society of the Missionaries of Africa, or the White Fathers. So Ataman was selected for education, and he began his education in Algiers and then Tunis. He quickly learned French. In 1880, he was taken to Malta, where his education continued, and in 1882, he began medical studies as training for his future life as a doctor catechist. Okay, so here we have some of the White Fathers with a group of these young Africans. He was one of 6 who was redeemed at that time. There's considerably more than 6 here, but I'm not sure which one he is in this photograph. But this sort of symbolises the relationship between these freed slave boys. And interestingly, I don't know if the White Fathers were redeeming slave girls very much at this time, but that's a question I'd like to look into. And here he is here. This is in 1885 as a young man. So A highlight of this period when he was being educated was in 1886, when a party of 12 Africans, including Artemin, were led by Lavigary on a pilgrimage to Rome, and they had a group audience with the Pope. Of course, Lavigary was the major propagandist, if you like, in the Catholic mission movement for the anti-slave trade initiatives. And then, of course, he was chosen for medical school in Malta at the age of 22 or 23. So maybe this is just before that time when he went to Malta. And then after training of several years, he was selected once again to work as a doctor catechist in East Africa. So now you have the end of the North African phase of his life, and the journey to East Africa. And of course that involved the voyage to Zanzibar, then crossing from Zanzibar to the mainland, to one of the caravan towns on the coast, a place called Sadani, which is now just a very small fishing village. But at that time, in the 1880s, 1890s, Sadani was a major caravan entrepot, and it's directly opposite Zanzibar, and just up the coast from Bagamoyo, the more important of these coastal entrepots. So, and then the mission party, including Artemin, joined a caravan led by the former Anglican lay missionary Charles Stokes, who had left the Church Missionary Society and set himself up as a caravan operator, and he became extremely successful at that. He married an African, daughter of an African chief, left the mission, the Church Missionary Society, and became probably the single most important caravan operator in East Africa. So then they began this arduous journey to Lake Tanganyika. Almost like crossing the Sahara, but perhaps not quite. I mean, it was up the main caravan route, the very well-established caravan route through Tabora. I'm sorry I don't have a map on the slides here. They passed through Tabora, where there was a White Father's mission, then to Ujiji on Lake Tanganyika, and then they crossed the lake by canoe, and then went down also by canoe to Karema, which is probably 200 to 300 kilometers south of Ujiji. So Artemin was to spend the rest of his life in Karema, and he married there. Here he is with his wife and son. 6 months after his arrival, he married Wansahira, the daughter of the chief, a former chief of the local Bende people on the east coast of Lake Tanganyika. Now, of course, this was an arranged marriage, obviously, and the aim of the missionaries was to marry into the local chiefly family, so that they could, and who else would do that, of course, but someone like Adrian Artemin, so that they could then facilitate mission work. This would then facilitate mission work amongst the surrounding African population. The Bende had a bit of a wild reputation at that time. This was a very unstable place and unstable time in East African history. The slave trade was still going on. It was connected mostly to the ivory trade, the larger experience of the ivory trade. But slaves were used for domestic work in commercial settlements and for agricultural work. And so there was a considerable amount of slave raiding and trading. Not so much to sell, although some of them were sold, but to incorporate into these new communities that I mentioned earlier. So it was a relatively unstable area, particularly because the Arab and Swahili and Niamwezi ivory and slave traders were very active just over the lake in the Congo, in the eastern Congo. So Karema was a relatively small outpost, but in many ways it was a similar to other mission stations in East Africa, except that it had been originally constructed as a small fort by the Belgians. Its population at the time that Artemin arrived included about 400 so-called orphans. Now, I don't believe that there were probably that many orphans. These would have been refugees, perhaps people abandoned by their families because of difficult circumstances and so on. Some of them would have been actual orphans, but probably a lot of them weren't. There was also a village of freed slaves at Karema. The men and the boys of the mission went about armed at that time because of the danger from robbers, bandits, and the surrounding caravan trails, and also because of the uncertainty about the local Bende people. So Artemin knew how to shoot. There were rare visits by Europeans. There were, of course, considerable contacts with some of the big traders who operated in this region of Western Tanzania and the Eastern Congo. And so Artemin not only served the local population in terms of his medical skills, but also served the caravans, treated injured porters, sick porters, and so on. That was part of her work. Of course, eventually there was the arrival of the Germans in 1893. They only really became a presence from about 1899 in this particular area. Indian traders arrived and settled at Karema, so that added to this the complexity of this small but very mixed, very cosmopolitan outpost. And of course, I'll just finish up. He began his medical work immediately on arrival. I'm not going to go into that in the longer paper too much. But let me just give you a quotation. The demand, of course, was well beyond his resources, the demand for medical services. There was an extreme shortage of medical supplies, particularly in the early years. So he writes of the first days, quote, "Cases of tropical ulcers, dysentery, fevers, and children with yaws and scabies were all lying together. My medicine comprised 20 kilos of camphor, a little carbolic acid, and a pecuana, which is a emetic. For instruments, a thermometer, an irrigator, and nothing else. There were many ticks, which we always swept up each morning before they finished their meals of blood for the day." So you can see this was extremely primitive conditions. But of course things gradually improved as the mission had more and more resources, and of course with the establishment of the colonial regimes and the peace that eventually prevailed. Now I'll just finish up by saying his long and distinguished service was recognized by Catholic and secular authorities, and he received an enormous, an unusual number of decorations. He was given a papal medal. In 1922 he was given 3 medals by the Belgian government because of his service to Belgian colonial troops during the First World War campaign. In 1935 he received the Medal of King George. This is the hospital, by the way, in this image. So the Medal of King George V of England. He received the Papal Bene Merente Medal, the Bronze Medal of Tanganyika Territory for services rendered, the Legion of Honor from the French government, and finally in 1955 the Welcome Medal from the British, which was the first, and he was the first African to receive the medal. And here he is with some of his decorations. Okay, sorry I just went slightly off. Thank you. Should we take questions after all of this, or?
Sure.
Yes.
Actually, is there any way to go back to the first slide?
Oh, okay, sure. For you. Yeah, okay. Okay, but it doesn't have down, oh, it does have the Norfolk down on it.
Yes, actually.
Okay, okay, okay.
So I apologize, I'm a bit more scripted and therefore not as engaging, I suppose, but I'll start out by just pointing out on the map the space that I'm going to speak to today in my paper. I work on northern Ghana, specifically the northeast, so this region here. Today's paper actually is a section of my dissertation that actually is looking at more Tamale, which is right, well, vaguely around this area, but it's just the French, well, during colonial times, the French-British border here is what I'd be concentrating on the majority of my dissertation. Now, yesterday afternoon, I was fortunate enough to sit in on the panel and spoke to gender hierarchies and democratic relations in post-conflict areas. And this panel made me think a lot about the way in which women are portrayed or altogether left out of nationalist histories. And as Jane Parkhart noted in this panel, the contributions of women during independence struggles and conflict are quickly downplayed or dismissed with the coming of peace, she says. And despite official language of gender equality and such put forth by the state, women who appear to transgress these gender norms quickly become the target of state-sanctioned efforts to regulate and enforce mobility, accumulation, and independence. Clearly, the study of methods by which the colonial and post-colonial state sometimes seeks to control transformations in gender and age relations remains an important task for historians of Africa. Today, I'll be discussing a snapshot of a chapter, my final chapter, actually, which is part of my larger project on women, gender, and development doctrine in northern Ghana. And this research was conducted in 2010 in the National Archives in Accra and the Regional Archives in Tamale. It addresses specifically the paternalist social welfare activities of two state-sanctioned, state-supported organizations. The Regional Committee for Social Education, specifically its progress campaign against undesirable social practices, that's their wording, not mine, and the Ghana Society for the Protection of Children. And I take 1965 to 1972 as an important period to address these two organizations because it's a period in which archival evidence suggests an increase in their activities, but also this was a time of significant political transition. This is following Nkrumah's overthrow in 1966, the transition to the National Liberation Council, and then the Progress Party as well. So these political transitions are particularly important to keep in mind, especially when we're looking at northern Ghana, because they directly affected local politics regarding chieftaincy, land, and resources, specifically in the northeast, in Baku, which is what I speak to primarily in my dissertation, where you're seeing Kusazi and Mampruzi, vying for control regarding chieftaincy and land and these types of things. Now, in addressing the activities of the Regional Committee for Social Education, and specifically its progress campaign, you must remember that these efforts are part of larger and longer histories of social welfare and community development that began sort of following World War II, so in the second colonial occupation. But following independence, the CPP viewed these so-called undesirable practices in northern Ghana as evidence of the region's continued backwardness and underdevelopment, and initially allowed individuals such as Hannah Kujo, who was very active in CPP organizing and politics, to go into northern Ghana and facilitate different programs. As I spoke to in the introduction of this presentation, she was eventually sidelined for increasing publicity and being too prominent of a figure. But the campaigns continued on, and so they survived the overthrow. And these campaigns spoke to other sort of issues which I speak to in my thesis, such as nudity, scarification, clitoridectomy, and prostitution. So following Nkrumah's overthrow, the campaigns took the form of crash campaigns, and they were meant to swiftly abolish these practices. And the central targets of these campaigns were overwhelmingly schoolgirls and young educated women, who, in migrating from the countryside to the capital in the north, Tamale, were seen as transgressing social norms or gender norms for various reasons. As the then Minister of Social Welfare, Mrs. Susanna Al-Hassan, described, the main concern for the Regional Committee in Tamale was the, quote, soaring rate of depravity and lewdness among our younger generation, especially schoolgirls and young working girls. But what constituted this perception of depravity and lewdness? According to the committee, schoolgirls and young working girls transgress gender and democratic norms through their increasing mobility and accumulation, specifically in terms of their employment and choices of leisure pursuits. With increased prevalence of female education, attendance of girls in the countryside in schools and colleges in Tamale was a hub for education at this time, educated girls were beginning to transgress these norms by choosing employment that was seen to be, quote, not commensurate to their education, and also frequenting bars and nightclubs where they would loiter or engage in illicit behavior. Now, to combat this perceived soaring rate of lewdness, the committee employed several strategies, first of which was to discourage young girls from drifting into urban spaces in the first place. This was a first-line strategy, and because it's first line, it demonstrates a concern in which these anxieties were entangled with larger issues regarding urbanization, the urbanization of Tamale taking place at this time. Indeed, the composition of the whole committee, police, Ministry of Health, Catholic, Muslim, Protestant church reps, and the Tamale Urban Council speaks to this, this role of urbanization, these anxieties. However, regulating these leisure spaces was a bit difficult, and the committee worked to regulate young women's mobility through the implementation of strict rules for employers of hotels, bars, and clubs, as well as their female employees. For example, employers were asked to review the pay of young working girls to, quote, avoid using them for immoral practices. So, of course, the implicit, connection here is with prostitution, which I'll get to. While regulating the accumulation of the employees was a bit more easy in terms of instituting rules, regulating the movement of young women frequenting the bars was a bit more difficult. Beyond strategies meant to just promote good and healthy recreational activities, the committee instructed establishments to turn away single, unattached girls who were younger than 17 and to discourage them from staying in hotels instead of the YMCA. What is interesting here is that it seems young women in Tamale were effective at transgressing the committee's attempts at trusteeship over their mobility and accumulation by employing strategies similar to those noted by scholars Kathleen Sheldon and Jean Allman. Jean Allman speaks to the rounding up of spinsters in colonial Asante and how women use different sort of strategies to escape basically being jailed. And so the strategies are very similar in the sense that women in Tamale seem to, after being kicked out of these bars, go back with a male friend and pose as husband and wife in order to gain entry to bars and hotels. And so basically what they're doing was co-opting the very gender norms they're transgressing, social norms they're transgressing, in order to secure their freedom of movement. Now, the concern for the committee regarding schoolgirls and young working girls was as much a product of Tamale's increasing urbanization as it was its important transformations taking place in age relations. While the committee expressed concerns common throughout urban Africa, that is, unrestricted movement of young women being tantamount to prostitution, it collaborated with the police in Tamale to implement raids on bars and clubs, referred benignly in the correspondence as checks. And attempts to prosecute these women, actually the attempts to prosecute them failed in Tamale Circuit Court because judges could not convict without material evidence of overt acts. Far from blaming the young girls solely, the committee also lamented those important men who felt solicited these young women to social evil. Indeed, the quintessential concern of social welfare at this time, that is being family breakdown, factored into the committee's work. So much so that two of the committee's most problematic suggestions, that is the implementation of marriage councils and the imposition of a curfew for young girls under 17, stem from concerns regarding the breakdown of the family unit. While neither suggestion was actually instituted, they did indicate the desire for state incursion not only into leisure spaces, but also the bedrooms of northern Ghanaians. And this didn't pan out, because the suggestion about instituting this curfew, for example, was actually based upon what they had read in terms of certain American states and curfews employed. And actually, it was blocked by the ministry, which said, look, this may be okay in some American states, but this infringes upon Ghanaian law. We can't actually do this. So it becomes clear the activities of the Regional Committee and the Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children are intimately intertwined when one considers how the very categories of schoolgirls, young women, and yes, even children are socially constructed by societies, and in this case, the post-independent state. That controlling the supposed lewdness of young girls was as much about transgressing gender norms and age relations as it was women's reproductive capacities is hardly surprising. Indeed, in the committee's words, this lewdness was, quote, rapidly sapping the morality of our future mothers of Ghana. Literature on colonial and post-colonial attempts to control women's reproduction is rich, and with the work of Lynn Thomas, The Politics of the Womb, historians are increasingly able to explore the intersection of state policies concerning women's bodies and reproduction. And the concern here in this paper is decidedly overt. Young women were vehicles for reproduction. And in this nascent nation state undergoing political transition, children were of central importance to Ghana's future. While historical literature on children and childhoods in Africa is sparse, Martin Klein and Audre Dipty have noted the importance of work on African childhoods, as children are the means by which societies biologically and also culturally reproduce themselves. The importance of children and their young mothers is made explicit in the society's mandate, which stresses, in Society of Prevention of Cruelty to Children, which stresses the reflection of child welfare on the new nation state, internationally and also domestically. And the mandates, actually, the wording is quite striking. It is known that cruelty to children exists because of deprivation in many ways, peculiarities in our culture, or from willful physical assaults. Our children are made to suffer as a result of these evils, which must be rooted out of our way of life in the new and progressive Ghana, which we all hope to build. Children are the nation's precious asset. They are weak, vulnerable to influences hostile to their development and welfare. They are defenseless, and as such, they are entitled to a special claim on our love, compassion, and all humanitarian instincts. In prioritizing the control of young women and children, the state expressed its desire to regulate a shifting ground in age relations in Tamale. However, in order to accomplish this trusteeship, the society employed tactics similar to the Regional Committee to co-opt control. Both organizations blamed modernity, or too swift development in the region, as part of why parents could not control their children. And this is really part of a longer sort of colonial narrative regarding the North, and this is very, very layered. You see it even in terms of how Accra would act towards Northern Ghana in terms of trusteeship and being and parental guidance, and this region being so underdeveloped that we need to act as trustees. And so it's very layered here. In the state's view, modernity had destroyed parents' ability to govern their children, and instead what was needed was state control, referred to as environmental control, along with educating parents, quote, through every possible medium to their responsibilities toward their children. Now, one important way the society accomplished this was through the establishment of children's homes. While literature on children's homes in Ghana is sparse, information on their 19th century British precursors indicate they served as a conduit for shelter, adoption, and sometimes child labor. What is clear in this case of the Tamale Children's Home is that the definition of orphan and process of adoption was constructed by the state and did not accurately correlate with the realities on the ground. We kind of spoke to that a bit, the construction of orphans and whether orphans are actually orphans. While I wish I could expand a bit more on this here, I will try to be brief. Archival evidence suggests that many of the children housed in the home were from the upper borderland regions of Ghana. These were regions that historically suffered from periods of famine. So, I mean, this goes back way, you see this in informal diaries in Baku in the Northeast. And this is quite significant in terms of how it affected pawning earlier, even in the late colonial period, which is what one of my chapters speaks to as well. And also during this time, we have to consider chieftaincy issues as well, and sort of simmering sort of conflict in this area. As one report from Baku Hospital states, children perceived to be orphans were often brought to the hospital for safekeeping. However, with the implementation of the children's home, these children fell under the care of the state and were transferred to the home for safekeeping. The confusion over whether these children were actually orphans is highlighted by a request filed in 1969 from 2 United Nations development workers in Accra for what they called, quote, orphan/neglected/unwanted children from the upper region. Literally, that is the actual exact. From the upper region, it gets better. From the upper region, then housed at the home. And galling, it's very galling that one applicant in particular requested a, quote, fair-skinned child from the north, further highlighting the racialized aspects of this rescue narrative. And those who have worked on international adoption, such as Karen Babinski at Queen's, speaks to this type of racialized rescue narrative. That the interpretation of orphan was disputed and constructed is evident in the response from the Regional Social Welfare and Community Development Officer, who gently explained that while more children were being collected from Baku Hospital, none could be described as orphans, unwanted, or neglected, as their parents and relatives remained interested in the children and visited from time to time. The officer's final comment about a mounting waiting list for adoption indicates the gap between local conditions on the ground and state efforts to exert trusteeship over children erroneously considered to be orphans in northern Ghana. Now, by way of conclusion, the activities of both organizations indicate a desire of the post-independent state to wrest control of children and youth away from parents, guardians, and relatives. Broadly speaking, the attempts to exert state trusteeship indicate a narrative of parental mismanagement, and this is crafted and very evident in the archives, the way in which parents are downplayed and seen as not being able to keep up with the ravages of modernity and having no control over their children. The state must come in. Environmental control is needed, and this is our task now, the nation state, so as not to have a mar upon the how the nation state is seen, both within the region and also internationally, and the eyes of these rising organizations, Save the Children, for example, which is really trying to kick off its activities in Africa. Now, however, as this paper has shown, these attempts were quite misplaced and far from successful. The social welfare activities of both organizations invite more questions than answers regarding the shifting terrains of gender, age relations, and gerontocracy in Tamale. Moreover, the actions of both committees for social education and society for children force us to ask who, in adopting this official language of international organizations, we saw that in the mandate of the society, who really benefits from these actions, and what these efforts have to tell us about struggles over trusteeship and, in fact, state sovereignty in northern Ghana. And just to sort of explain a bit more, I'm looking at this particular period, and this is Cold War in Africa, and this is a time in which international organizations are looking for inroads to exert their own trusteeship, and this is evident in my broader chapter. These struggles for trusteeship, not just on the ground in Ghana, between officials in Accra and in the north, but also the state itself and its sort of feeling, the sentiment to display these actions that and retain sovereignty over these types of issues in the face of Save the Children and United Nations and these types of organizations.
Good timing. Okay, Raquel's next.
I'm sharing part of my PhD research on the Natives Land Act in South Africa. I'm studying how land segregation started being built as an idea in the early 20th century. First of all, I'm sorry about my accent, so feel free to interrupt me or anything. Or if you don't understand something, just feel free.
Can you speak a little bit louder?
Yeah, it always happens. Sorry. Okay, so I'll try to stick to the text so I don't get kind of confused, as you may have noticed. Okay. I'm Brazilian. Living in a different country for a couple of months really puts things in perspective. In my case, for the past few days, one thing in particular got my attention: the role of the press and media in the building of knowledge and social relations. By the occasion of the recent and tragic events in Boston, I had the chance to follow the news in American, Canadian, and Brazilian newspapers. While the North American press had its main focus on explaining the incident and the political implications of it, as well as in reporting the support given to the victims, the headline used by one of the most famous Brazilian websites was "Brazilian runner crossed the finishing line minutes before the first explosion." What is told, to whom is told, and how is told? Inescapable questions to understand the process of not only reporting the news, but also of building what is wanted to be a common sense on substantial matters. In August 1902, Mr. Graham Greene, appointed civil commissioner of the British Empire in the Cape Colony, was invited to the opening of the new departure of Orantaia Becoana, or the Becoanas Gazette, a weekly publication that started circulating in Kimberley on a regular basis just the year before. In his speech, Mr. Greene attested, and I quote, "I should like those connected to this publication to bear in mind that they have a powerful instrument in their hands, for in no way is the saying that the pen is mightier than the sword more exemplified than the publication of a newspaper," end quote. By 1902, only 3 other African newspapers circulating somehow regular basis in South Africa, giving voice to a group of people that in the coming decades would see their social and political rights increasingly reduced. The African press became then a fundamental form of expression of the native opinion. The Becoanas Gazette ended its activities by 1905, mostly because of a combination of both technical and financial difficulties. Its editor, though, was to keep on his engagement in spreading what he thought to be the four main principles that should guide the life of the native: labor, sobriety, thrift, and education. Saul Plaatje became known as one of the most important names on African political and intellectual elite that in the first decade of the 20th century was quite active in the debates about African participation in the national state that started to be planned in the aftermath of the Anglo-Boer War in 1902. In 1910, the first edition of what was to be known as the successor of Coranta, the Sala ya Becoana, or the Friend of Becoana, started circulating in Kimberley. The Friend of Becoana got attention beyond the frontiers of Eastern Cape, having a faithful group of readers also in Johannesburg and Oranje, for instance. And one of its readers in Johannesburg once recalled how, and I quote, "it was almost marvelous to see how much the little paper was in demand out there." End of quote. Another social group who was also concerned about its participation in the national state that started to be idealized in 1902, a group to which historiography has not paid much attention when it comes to understanding the peculiar political movements after the Anglo-Boer War. I'm talking about the Uitlanders, the outlanders or the foreigners, particularly about a group of white Anglophone men living in the former Boer republics without supporting Boer politics, but also not totally integrated to the British imperial policy, building an identity that is in constant negotiation. Between 1902 and 1910, when the South African national state was the main theme in discussion, two daily newspapers helped not only to enlarge this discussion, but also to establish a central space for sharing political aspirations and social aggravations in the Orange Free State and in Transvaal, the Star and the Rand Daily Mail. The Star was launched in Johannesburg in 1889. The support of the mining companies has secured facilities and techniques of modern newspaper production that cannot be compared to the reality faced by African press. At first moderate in its discourse, the Star grew to be one of the main supporters of those against the British annexation of the Boer republics, propagating ideals of federalism and liberalism. The Rand Daily Mail is recognized today as one of the most important English daily papers published in Transvaal. This newspaper was to play an important role in South Africa history some decades later, especially for its anti-apartheid editorial. Launched in 1902, the Rand set an incisive tone in its defense of federalism as a political system to govern the Union of South Africa. In approximating these two groups of newspapers in our analysis, my point is that in a moment when all the attentions were focused on the future of the relationship between British and Boers in South Africa, several other actors were trying to guarantee British imperial support to their causes, negotiating political rights and assuring the national state that was in discussion. In this sense, newspapers acted as a fundamental arena to topics that otherwise could be buried under the argument that they were not part of the discussion about the national state. In other words, a denial to these groups in accessing the South African nation. In June 1913, the Parliament of the Union of South Africa approved the Natives Land Act, one of the first acts of a legislation that in the coming years was to transform segregation de facto into segregation de jure. It was also the first time that spatial segregation was thought in terms of South African nation under a unified legislation. The idea of a legalized territorial separation between blacks and whites in what is today South Africa was not new. Much has been written, for instance, about the Glengarry Act. Promulgated in 1894 in the Cape Colony, the act reduced native landholding to 3.2 hectares and imposed a labor tax that, according to Cecil Rhodes, and I quote, would help blacks to find out something about the dignity of labor, end quote. Repealed only in 1991, the Natives Land Act designated land on a racial basis. It prohibited black South Africans from acquiring, leasing, and negotiating land outside native reserves that represented 7.5% of South African territory by then. The Act also abolished the sharecropping system and labor tenancies. Much has been written about the land legislation as a measure linked to mining interests, particularly in the creation of reservoirs of labor. Although undeniable, the idea that restricting African access to land would end up leading to a major labor supply to the growing South Africa Industrial Revolution needs to be taken beyond common sense and understood in its other implications in a broader political scenario. In the beginning of the 20th century, South Africa was a territory devastated by a combination of rinderpest and war, facing growing apprehensions. While all the attentions were concentrated on the future of the relationships between British and Boers, two other groups were also trying to find space in this new scenario. A large group of Africans who fought the war on the British side, hoping that a British victory could extend the so-called liberal tradition of the Cape Colony to larger areas of the territory, and a class of the Uitlanders who face an increasing competition with natives, particularly in the produce markets and in access to land. The war and rinderpest deeply changed social and economical relations in South Africa. If in the last 2 decades of the 19th century there were signs of white governments rethinking policies to attract Africans into white areas in order to address labor needs, now these Africans became direct competitors to them. Following the press between 1902 and 1913, one can realize the growing articulation of discourses about rights to the land, education, work, and citizenship in a moment when what was in discussion was who, after all, was the South Africa in the nation that was being built. In October 14, 1903, the Coranta Yabequana published an article written by its editors, Alplaki, advocating the inescapable integration of what he saw as the 3 sections of the South African community. There are 3, and I quote, "There are 3 sections in the community, viz. English, Dutch, and natives. Socially, the former 2 are one, thus the 3 sections are metaphorically fused into 2 distinct parts, white and black, but the whole is politically inseparable. The white race can no more do without the black, and the black without the white." End of quote. What the editor of the Coranta Yabequana was advocating was not new. Since 1880, a group of Anglophone intellectuals had started debate about the inescapable integration of races in South Africa, but now this idea was permeating African political affirmation in the national state. In the following years, 2 major topics were in the agenda of the debates concerning the South African nation. First of them was the possibility of granting representative government to the former Boer republics, British colonies since the end of the Anglo-Boer War. And in 1905, the appointed Native Affairs Commission was to present a major report on what was now being called the native question in South Africa. Between 1903 and 1905, a group of experts visited several areas of the territory investigating aspects of native life, concentrating particularly on religious practices, access to alcohol, and access to land. One of the most frequent of the white grievances was squatting by renters that was believed to aggravate the labor shortage and also to undermine white farming productivity. During this debate, Coranta Yabequana articulated most of the African concerns with the situation. By the end of 1904, the article "Half a Loaf is Better Than No Bread" discussed the rumor that the Native Affairs Commission was to recommend the New Zealand form of separate parliamentary representation for South Africa. The newspaper also commented on the land policy in New Zealand, and I quote, In New Zealand, natives are landowners. They may only lease but cannot legally sell ground to the whites. In Transvaal, on the other hand, the whites are the landowners. Legally, they may sell land to the natives, but the Transvaal Native Affairs Department has stoutly opposed every such transaction for fear that investment in fixed property will make the native independent. End quote. At the same time, the white Anglophone press in Transvaal and Orange Free State adopted an incisive tone in presenting the news on the political scenario, but it also presented on its pages from short notes to larger reports, which create a growing expectation in its readers. The Rand Daily Mail published the section named Farmers and Native Locations, where the reader could find the updates on the meetings of several farmers' associations and questions regarding what started to be called Native Locations Act, presented as a practical solution to the native question. Linked to this topic is we can find the access to land debated in several other parts of the newspaper. When the debates about the construction of railroads or irrigation techniques to improve farming, for instance, start to take place, one can understand it as a narrative of superiority that goes beyond the political, reinforcing the idea that the right to land should be with who is capable to produce, to feed the population and an economy in reconstruction after war. While the Star and the Daily Mail had support of the mining companies, African journalists had little access to the technologies of printing and distributing newspapers. Literacy was also an important factor to the African press. According to the census by 1911, literacy rate among the African adult population was of 6.8%. These factors put together revealed that the impact of the African press in South African politics, African press in South African politics, given that regardless of all these obstacles, Sala Yabequana got the attention, for instance, of politicians like Theophilus Schreiner. Known as a firm supporter of the native rights, Schreiner was one of the most active politicians debating the real impacts of a territorial segregation between whites and natives. In his speech in the parliament, Schreiner constantly called on texts published by the African press to argue that the act in discussion in the beginning of 1913 was about to transform the whole land policy of the Union of South Africa into the land policy of the Transvaal and Orange Free State. When we recall that one of the points of African support to the British forces during the Anglo-Boer War was the expectation that a British victory could lead to an extension of the right to vote that prevailed in the Cape Colony, based on annual income and not on racial basis, to the Boer republics and to NATO, it became quite clear that to restrict African access to land was also to restrict their access to citizenship, or to a share in the national state. The press played an important role both in articulating political resistance to segregation as well as in reinforcing ideas of a racialized nation in the first decade of the 20th century. It got the attention of multiple audiences, transforming what could end up being very local newspapers into main characters in the political scenario. And in conclusion, when I was in South Africa last year doing archival research, I had the chance to talk to a quite recognized scholar. When I told him what my research topic was about, he said to me, "You see, the problem with the Natives Land Act is that it actually didn't take land away from South African natives. It actually expanded and secured their access to land by creating the reserves." Last week, as I was following the news on a South African website, one almost hidden line caught my attention as it stated, "Land dispute threatens mining town residents." And it led me to know the story of Elliot Malibeng, who, along with 250 other households in the East Rand area, had been served eviction notices by a private company that bought the land from the mine. It made me wonder again about what is told, to whom is told, and how is told.
Questions, comments?
Guess three short questions, one for each. Start with Steve. I was just wondering how much what he, what's his name?
Atterman, yeah.
Because he's writing this, presumably his audience are mostly white missionaries. So he probably doesn't say, or he's probably very careful with what he says about his relationship with the missionary hierarchy. And so I was just wondering what, if at all, he said about that, because obviously from other sources we often know that there's a lot of tension between black missionaries within and white hierarchy.
That's a good question.
Yeah. And on the other hand, also, you know, he's married to, was it the daughter of the chief?
Yes.
There's, you know, there too, I'm wondering, like, what is he saying about his relationship with the traditional authorities in the area and things like that? Because, you know, there too, there can often be quite a bit of tension. And actually, I find this fascinating because I'm working on South Africa. I don't necessarily have that much background in teaching on slavery, but you know, obviously I need to get to know it better as I'm starting to teach more and more. And you know, the go-to for slave narratives is of course always Equiano, but I'd love to.
There's lots more.
Yeah, I know, but I'm trying to explore this more and more. And I know there's so much of it.
Yeah, no, these are excellent questions. And the first one, of course, yes, because you do in many missions. I mean, I'm not a specialist in missions, but I'm certainly not by any means. But my original work, the work that I spent most time is on caravans and you know the trading commercial caravans of 19th century East Africa, and a huge proportion, a considerable proportion of my written sources are mission sources, because the missions, you know, utilize exactly the same transportation and communication networks that were the traders used. There was no other form of transport. So I'm reasonably familiar with the mission writings, particularly on East Africa. But also recently I was on a PhD committee for a project on West African missions, West Indian missions in the Rio Pongus region of Guinea. And in that thesis there was some in fact one of the major themes of the thesis was this tension, this conflict between black missionaries from the West Indies and white missionaries. The tensions, of course, revolved around discrimination and conditions of service and salaries and leadership roles and so on. So that is a somewhat different circumstance than the position that Adrian Arterman was in, because don't forget he was a freed slave, right? That's his origins. That's how he ends up in the mission. Whereas in the case of these, well, I guess one could make a similar argument about these West Indian missionaries, except that they're a generation further down the line. You know, they are a little bit more removed from that slave experience and brought up in a very different environment in the Caribbean. And so for them, racial discrimination was extremely, felt very, very much, and it hurt badly. I don't even get a hint of that in this autobiography. But once again, as you say, exactly, it is written essentially for a mission audience. One would like to look at other sources, I'm still in the early stages of this project. One would like it to look in other sources about the mission, associated with the mission, sources, maybe visitors to the mission, to see whether there are any of these kinds of tensions. What we get from the autobiography is a life of service, essentially. I showed you the medals, and I talked about all the decorations and so on. So this is not a guy who rocked the boat. This is not a guy who complained. I think probably he saw his life as a doctor catechist, although in very difficult conditions, as better than what he might have ended up having, because most slaves from the Niger Band region ended up in terrible conditions, terrible hardship in oases, producing dates. They often ended up in Sahara oases where the slave population was very high. So he might have seen himself as relatively lucky.
I just have a follow-up question actually regarding.
I didn't get to the
source.
second one, sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Sorry
go
about
on.
cutting you off. It's just follow up to that. It just made me think. You were talking about what's left out of the narrative. You were talking about how it's curious that conversion is left out and education is what's highlighted mostly. But I wonder what else you can say in terms of silences and what this archive is really telling you in terms of. It is a life of service that he's, deciding to focus on. But in terms of even the transcontinental nature, what's present and what is silent from what you're sort of finding beyond what you've already spoke to.
Well, as I said at the earlier on, he the narrative is about 50 pages, and the autobiography is about 50 pages, and they're very closely typed. It was retyped. A4 paper. So it's actually quite, parts of it are relatively detailed, parts of it, there are huge gaps. Of the 50 pages, probably no more than 5 deal with his origins and his experience as a child slave. And that's the part I'm paying most attention to. Yeah, at least at this point. Although, as I said earlier, I'm also very interested in this construction of new sort of multi-ethnic, modern in quotation marks, communities in East Africa. So yeah, there's a huge amount left out. I think in any of these slave narratives, that's going to be inevitable. Just on the marriage, getting back to your second question on the marriage, it's not a happy marriage. That's quite clear. And don't forget, Adrian Arterman, by this time he speaks, it's said he speaks perfect French. I don't know if he ever spoke good English, because of this, of course, eventually becomes a British League of Nations mandate. I don't know if he learned German, because it was a German colony. It was German East Africa for a very long period. So, but he was educated, and he marries this uneducated, rural young woman from the back of beyond, essentially. This is instrumental. It's not a marriage of love in any way. So there are tensions there, and those tensions, because it's very personal, obviously for him, those tensions are in the autobiography. She ran away at one point, and she had to be brought back by the chief's family. They did have to pay. They did go through the traditional Bende marriage ceremony, as well as, of course, the Catholic ceremony. So they did both. So this was all about constructing a network of relationships between the mission and the local people. So this was all purely political.
I just have a question. Perhaps going more to the beginning of your presentation, you were looking at women. I was just wondering what you thought of women moving to. This is not an area I know very much about, so excuse my question. But women moving into urban areas, but also how much power do women, you kind of talk about women gaining some power, kind of transgressing rules and having some space to do that. But how much power do women lose by changing fertility? There is power in the woman's fertility in some societies, and I'm wondering how much power they lose by transgressing what people perceive as the traditional role, and that first step into a different way of life. I'm just wondering how much power do women lose, and how much do older women see this lewdness of young women being don't do that kind of thing.
That's always a difficult question when we talk about power and agency, and especially when you're talking about gender in West Africa. First, I'd like to say that in terms of urbanization, I speak a bit about urbanization in this final chapter. The remainder of the dissertation doesn't deal with it because I'm mostly focused in Baku in the Northeast, and that's not as much of a question. But I mean, it's interesting space in terms of, you know, West Africa, but women have such long histories in urban centers, right? But Tamale is interesting because this is more of a colonial-made city. City, and I use it very loosely because it's a very relative term. You can't look at Tamale in the way you look at Accra or Kumasi or anything like that. But you know, urbanizing, something like that. But it's colonial, right? It was part to move the northern capital there, and so these anxieties, I think, are very much connected to that sort of construction as well. And I don't necessarily see, you know, these women using these strategies as, you know, negating, you know, any sort of norms that they may feel. I don't really see it as sort of, you know, this or that. Like, I see it as, you know, certain situations, certain strategies are employed, and perhaps different strategies will be employed, you know, within this rural-urban nexus, right? It can look differently in different sort of spaces, but at least within these certain urban leisure sort of areas, right, in which there is this control that's being placed upon these women, I find the strategies that at least the archive is sort of, you know, implying, suggesting, to be quite interesting as to how they're transgressing. Does that mean they're transgressing other norms? Not necessarily, and it's too difficult for me to infer that. All I can really say is, okay, this is interesting what's happening in bars and nightclubs in this particular space. How they behave outside of that space, no, and in terms of the realities of behavior, that's something you can't infer either. So this is all, unfortunately, just speaking to social constructions, you know, and perceived sort of lewdness and whatnot. But I think there's certainly enough literature on scapegoating women in urban spaces, you know, as we saw in yesterday's panel, and you know, certainly literature on prostitution as well, and literature on women actually co-opting that sort of perceived idea of the prostitute to transgress sort of, you know, gender norms, and we see that during periods of conflict as well. That being done. So I mean, there's different strategies that are used at different times for different reasons, but it's different to pigeonhole any, you know, anyone in terms of looking at how that reflects upon power and whether power's increased or decreased. Yeah, but it's a good question to think about, though. I mean, it's just difficult to marry that when you're just looking at social constructions.
No, of course, yeah. And my second question is, I was just wondering, in terms of, right, and kind of a double question. On the one hand, I mean, in Cape Colony, in that early stage, there was the outbreak of plague used to segregate, moving people out of urban areas. And I was wondering how much that came up in the press, in terms of using the press to segregate, or using the press to portray Black people as like plague carriers or whatever. I don't know if that came up in the mail. I mean, in the daily paper. And the second question I had was in terms of, I mean, looking at, I don't know if you've looked at any of the newspapers on the next, like, legitimating some of the, like, the land policies now by saying, oh, we don't want to make South Africa the next Zimbabwe, or, you know, that kind of a thing. And I'm wondering if that's incorporated into your analysis, just as a current, or if you had any comments on that.
Well, thanks. Yes. About Black plague portraying, not only Black people were being portrayed as a plague, but also Chinese immigrants that were brought to work on mines in 1907. There's this fear about constructing the national state with another element that is not the white man in this first decade. On the other hand, the so-called native newspapers or African newspapers are trying to portray the Black integration to society, to how the nation is being developed. And about the land policy nowadays, it's kind of a big tension in South Africa, and people don't want to talk about it. you know, when you tell you're studying land legislation, they just, oh, really? Why? Aren't you from Brazil? Aren't you supposed to be doing something about Brazil? So, so it was kind of a shock. So, I mean, the Land Act has 100 years this year. So it was repealed in 1991. So it's really something. And I guess just debating it kinds of put in perspective the rainbow nation that is something that they are trying to keep on defending, but it's not a reality in South Africa for a long time. I'm sorry about it's always get clumsy.
Can I just follow up from that?
Oh, crazy.
Yeah. The people you talk to about, your work, and they ask, oh, why are you doing this? Or they're surprised by what you're doing. I mean, which perspective are they coming from? Are they white people or are they Africans?
Oh,
in South Africa?
Was that I told about?
I thought you just said that people were asking in South Africa.
Yeah.
Or surprised that a Brazilian would be interested in this. But is it the topic or because you're Brazilian? Which is it?
I guess both of things.
Yeah.
When I was in South Africa, there was this curiosity about how Brazil deals with the past of slavery.
Yeah.
South Africa has this thing about thinking the past and dealing with the apartheid process and an idea to separate this racial segregation of time. So people kept me asking, is there are there slave museums in Brazil?
Mm-hmm.
What is the kind of memory that do you have about slavery in Brazil? And the fact is we have none. We just don't deal with slavery in Brazil.
But just once again, I'm curious about this because I taught I worked in South Africa for some time in the 90s, just after the end of apartheid, and it seems to me that African people are going to have most African people are going to have a very different perspective on the land issue than white people, and so if you tell them that's your project, they may come out with a very different response because, of course, it is a festering issue that is not being dealt with very much.
Not only South Africa, but I guess in Angola as well.
Yeah.
And there are also problems in Southern Africa.
In Southern Africa in general.
Yeah. Land policy is kind of a big issue.
Which is why Mugabe politicized that precisely so much, because it's such a emotive issue. Anyway, it's very interesting.
I could also pick up on that. I mean, the Native Land Act is symbolically very important. It's the this symbol of segregationist legislation. But the person you talked to said, actually, the Native Land Act didn't immediately necessarily do all that much. It's probably right. And it depends. And I think here's where maybe you want to look into, for example, newspapers from Natal as well. But I don't know when Ilanga started to get published. It might actually be after 1930. I'm not sure. But if you look, for example, at the, all the testimonies in the 1906 Native Lands Commission or something like that. 1906, something like that. Is it 1905? Yeah. If you go through all these thousands of pages of testimony, actually there's a fair bit of African witnesses coming to say, yeah, we want this. We want further encroachment to stop. We want to have land set aside that can be taken over by whites anymore. And I think it's very important here to look at where you're looking, because when you're looking at Pledge, you're looking at the High Veld, most impacted initially by the Native Land Act was probably the Free State. If you look at Natal, if you look at Eastern Cape, arguably there was something to be defended there by an African. Eastern Cape, initially very little land was alienated. Natal, this was just set onto national law, what was already practiced since the 1840s, 1850s. And you know, it was being sold, and many believed it to be initially protection for a lot of Africans. And my experience, my own research is in Natal, is that initially a lot of African elite sections support this. So, you know, looking at you know, the voices of African elites in, especially Natal, I think probably also Eastern Cape, might give you a very different picture than looking at the Botswana Gazette or something like that, and looking at Black you know, of course, Native Land Act is, you know, is one of the inspirations, of course, also for first South African Native National Congress. And but you also see there initially very few Africans from Natal joined. It's only later that Africans from what's today KZN joined. So I don't know when Langa starts getting published. It might only be later, so that might be a practical problem for that. But I'm sure it's something they can find.
It's always hard to put together all different discourses in South Africa.
Yeah.
Different voices and different actors are speaking all the time. But what I'm trying to do to deal with all these multiple voices is to think about a unified nation. So what was the discourse about building a national state and how land policy was thinking was thinking this union, to put it that way. And of course you have Africans that were supporting the act, as well as you have white farmers not supporting the land act because they were about to lose labor. But the main thing is trying to choose which voice they want to focus on and write.
I mean, looking at 1913, it's been one colony for 3 years.
And
Yeah. I mean, while obviously this was all British Empire, and there were certainly a lot of things that had similar, you know, kind of policies, but you know, the realities in Natal or Transvaal or the Cape Colony are very different. There's very different dynamics going on, and probably, you know, what major explicit reason, at least for union, is, you know, unifying this so-called native policy. But I think there's a good argument to be made that while there was some unification going on among, you know, white colonial elites, it's probably a bit early to look for the same among Africans. Concerns of Africans in Durban or rural Zululand are, I think, very different from those in the Free State, for example.
I'm trying to focus on like the grand areas. Or
Right.
Mainly white discourse about the Native Land Act.
Right, yeah.
I think the blacks didn't have any voice. You see, each time you talk during the term of apartheid and you start saying, let us look at the blacks were voiceless. You see, all what you get is what some people thought the blacks wanted. You see what I mean? People might write very big books and say, okay, the blacks and this, and it is put very well. But the reality is, until 1994, the blacks didn't have much voice. Things were just imposed on them. And when people say, and there were also quite a lot of discordant voices, especially when you look at the Ingata and that one. So really, some were even bought, some became puppets, and so it's very difficult to say the black's voice was this, because the black person didn't have a voice. The same applies to Zimbabwe. The black people during Ian Smith's time didn't have a voice. People were simply told what to do, and they did it. But they didn't like it. And the truth is now coming. And when it comes to the Mugabe, I think she asked about South Africa not falling the Mugabe way. What Robert Mugabe did, I think almost 100% of Zimbabweans accepted that. The only difference is the methodology which was used. It's not that the blacks didn't want to take all those farms, no.
Yeah.
You see, when it comes to South Africa again, this is one thing. People have tended to look at South Africa. South Africa is viewed, you see, in the West as a good country. Why? Simply because it has preserved their capitalism, they are wealthy, they are what, and South Africa has looked nicely that way. But if you look at what is happening today with the high unemployment, I don't know how long it will take before it explodes. You know what I mean? Because poverty, I visited South Africa. I come from Zimbabwe. I visited South Africa. I worked in South Africa. Some people, generally, they were better off during apartheid than they are today. Socially, economically, I think some people were better off during apartheid than what is today. So I don't know how long, with all that corruption going on, how long that will be sustained. Yeah.
No, I think you're right. Yeah. But I do think one can still find a voice, even if you cannot get a comprehensive view, right? You know, you'll never get a comprehensive view of African opinion, precisely for the reasons you said, and precisely because the sources are relatively few.
Yeah.
You know, the newspapers, but how many, what were their circulations? You know, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, you know, very small, very, very tiny.
And you know, whose right goes there?
Exactly, yeah, yeah. So that's so okay. There's some kind of voice. I mean, I've read Plucky, and I respect what he wrote. I mean, he's an important figure, but you know, not very representative. And but yes, I think you're absolutely right. Sorry, I don't know your name, but some of these historic questions are still simmering. You know, the land question in South Africa, the ANC won't touch it. They had a good minister, I've forgotten his name, it was an Afrikaner, I think, about 10 years ago.
I know him.
And he was actually serious about doing something, and they got rid of him. It was a white guy who was going to do something about it, and they got rid of him. They don't want to touch the land question. It's a huge can of worms.
Can I interject just one more question one more question at you. Sorry to shift gears, but I also wanted to know, just really quickly, I don't know lots about your view on your topic, but I think it's really interesting. So, okay, so with Kenya, I know you're not focusing on Kenya at all, but like I think with say Kenyatta's Stefan, his view on circumcision at the beginning was changed the official policy, and I'm just wondering top down what the policy on circumcision was in Ghana, in rural areas, and like if Nkrumah changed, shifted focus, or if it was positive. I know that's not quite the topic for your paper, but that's interesting.
No, it's a great question because I don't focus on that topic in the post-independence period. I look at it during the 1930s.
Okay.
In northern Ghana, and inquiries that had led to the female circumcision controversy in Kenya regarding the status of women, put forth by Eleanor Rathbone and Duchess of Atholl. Those reached West Africa too, and so part of the beginning of my thesis, actually, first 3 chapters, deals with actually what can be referred to as the West Africa policy, and this is regarding land, and it's of course on the land question, and this is tied to gender. It's tied to the way in which certain practices are dealt with or not dealt with. And in the case here, what my work tries to show is that in northern Ghana, the building of community and indirect rule and the maintenance of tradition or perceived tradition was really mobilized in a way to not intervene in something like female circumcision. And you can see parallels in other sort of practices as well. It's just unique in the sense that what really sort of got that issue moving was these interventionists in terms of the female circumcision controversy in Kenya and really the backlash there. And officials in West Africa, British West Africa, were at least, we do not want to touch this. We don't want to deal with this. We're not going there. And so a lot of the correspondence is, deals with talking about the elevated status of women, and that, if anything, they need more control because they're too independent. And that's the discourse that kind of happens around female circumcision, these types of things. And they just didn't want to intervene in initiation at all. They saw it as destabilizing politically. So the Women's War, that was happening over, they didn't want to really be creating something like that in Ghana, in the Gold Coast. So it's interesting, and that's one of my chapters deals with that.
Okay, cool.
So, good. Thanks for listening.
I think we're out of time. Yeah, it's after 10:30. Thank you to my co-panelists.
Thank you.